There is a strange problem hiding in plain sight. A person can look healthy, have a normal body weight, appear active, and feel completely fine, while something inside their metabolism is already changing. There may be no warning pain, no dramatic symptom, nothing obvious in the mirror, and yet, beneath the surface, the body may be working harder and harder to keep one of its most important systems under control. That system is insulin. Insulin is the hormone that helps move glucose from the bloodstream into cells, where it can be used for energy. When the system works normally, blood sugar rises after a meal, the pancreas releases insulin, and the body's cells respond. It is a remarkably efficient system. But what happens when the cells gradually stop responding to insulin as effectively as they once did? That is the mystery of insulin resistance. And there is one part of this mystery that makes it particularly difficult to see. You cannot reliably identify insulin resistance by looking at someone. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention explicitly notes that a person does not have to have overweight or obesity to have insulin resistance. Family history, physical inactivity, blood lipid patterns, and other factors can also play a role. So the old mental picture, insulin resistance equals obvious excess weight, is incomplete. And that matters because the process can remain quiet for years. In the United States alone, the CDC estimates that more than 115 million adults have prediabetes, and about 8 in 10 do not know they have it. Prediabetes is not the same thing as insulin resistance, and not everyone with insulin resistance has prediabetes. But the two conditions can sit along the same metabolic pathway. The important question is not simply, how much does this person weigh? It is much more complicated. What is happening inside their liver? How much fat is being stored around internal organs? How are their muscles responding to insulin? What does their genetic background allow their body to tolerate? And perhaps most importantly, how long can the body hide the problem before a routine blood test finally reveals it? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. Imagine you have just eaten. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, and glucose enters your bloodstream. The rise in blood glucose sends a signal to the pancreas. The pancreas releases insulin. Insulin then acts, in simple terms, like a signal telling cells that energy is available and that glucose needs to be moved out of the bloodstream and into tissues. The liver also responds to insulin by changing how it stores and releases glucose. Under normal circumstances, this entire process is tightly regulated. But insulin resistance changes the equation. The cells become less responsive to insulin. The pancreas detects the problem and compensates by producing more insulin. For a while, this can work, and this is where the story becomes almost deceptive. A person can be developing insulin resistance while their blood glucose still looks relatively normal. Why? Because the pancreas is fighting back. It is producing more insulin to overcome the reduced response. The blood test may therefore look reassuring, while the body is quietly demanding more insulin to achieve the same result. The CDC describes this progression in similar terms. When cells do not respond normally to insulin, the pancreas produces more insulin. Eventually, it may no longer be able to keep up, allowing blood glucose to rise into the prediabetes and diabetes ranges. So the first twist in our investigation is this. Normal blood sugar does not necessarily tell us how hard the body is working to maintain that normal level. That does not mean every person with normal blood sugar has hidden insulin resistance. It means the visible number is only one part of a much larger biological story. And that story becomes even more interesting when we look at body fat. For decades, body weight has been one of the easiest ways to think about metabolic risk. Higher body weight is associated with a higher risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. That association is real. But researchers have increasingly found that where fat is stored may matter as well. Two people can have a similar body weight and very different metabolic profiles. Some people store more fat beneath the skin. Others may accumulate more fat around internal organs, including around the liver and other abdominal structures. This is one reason scientists have become interested in what is sometimes described as metabolically unhealthy normal weight. Research has identified a subgroup of people with normal range body weight who nevertheless have an unhealthy metabolic profile. One review estimated that roughly 20% of normal weight adults may fall into this category, although definitions and estimates vary between studies. The implication is important. The bathroom scale measures mass. It does not tell you everything about metabolic health. Researchers have also found genetic clues that may help explain why some relatively lean people develop insulin resistance. A review of the evidence describes genetic variants associated with insulin resistance that appear to be linked to differences in how and where body fat is stored, including a higher proportion of visceral fat relative to subcutaneous fat. In other words, biology does not distribute risk equally. Two people can live in the same city, eat similar meals, have similar body weights, and still respond differently to the same metabolic pressures. But genetics is not the whole story. There is another organ hiding in this investigation: the liver. The liver plays a central role in maintaining blood glucose between meals. It stores glucose when energy is plentiful and releases it when the body needs fuel. Insulin helps regulate that process. When insulin resistance develops, the liver can become less responsive to insulin signals. This can contribute to abnormal glucose regulation and increased metabolic strain. And that brings us to another uncomfortable possibility. The problem may not begin with the dramatic rise in blood sugar that eventually gets someone's attention. It may begin much earlier, with subtle changes in how different organs handle energy. Meanwhile, muscles are also part of the story. Muscle tissue is one of the major places where glucose can be taken up after insulin signals that glucose is available. That means muscle activity and metabolic health are closely connected. This does not mean that every inactive person is insulin resistant, or that exercise alone explains every case. It means physical activity is one of several factors researchers have repeatedly connected with insulin sensitivity. The CDC lists physical inactivity among recognized risk factors for prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, but there is still a question left unanswered. If insulin resistance can develop silently, if body weight does not tell the entire story, and if genetics, fat distribution, liver function, muscle activity, and other factors can interact, why are some people affected while others seem to remain metabolically resilient? That is where the investigation becomes much more complicated. Because insulin resistance is not caused by one single switch being flipped, it is better understood as the result of interacting biological systems, and scientists are still working out exactly how those systems influence one another. There are established facts. Insulin resistance is strongly linked to the development of prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Risk is influenced by factors including body composition, physical activity, family history, age, and other metabolic conditions. There are also unanswered questions. Why does one person's metabolism deteriorate at a particular point while another person's remains relatively stable? Why can some people carry excess body fat without immediately developing major metabolic abnormalities? Why can some relatively lean people develop significant metabolic disease? And how much of this difference comes from genetics, environment, lifestyle, aging, fat distribution, sleep, or combinations we have not fully understood? These questions matter because insulin resistance is not simply a number on a laboratory report. It can be the beginning of a much longer story. And that story is often invisible at first. The CDC notes that prediabetes can exist for years without clear symptoms. That means the body may be compensating long before a person feels sick. Think about what that means. A person goes to work. They exercise occasionally. They fit comfortably into their clothes. They feel normal. They eat dinner. They sleep. They wake up the next morning. Nothing appears to have changed. But inside the body, the pancreas may be working harder to maintain glucose control than it did years earlier. Eventually, that compensation may become insufficient. Blood glucose begins to rise. prediabetes may appear, and later, for some people, type 2 diabetes can develop. This is not inevitable. It is also not a simple story of personal failure. Risk is shaped by biology, environment, family history, age, body composition, activity, and other factors. And that distinction matters, because once we stop judging metabolic health by appearance alone, a different picture emerges. The real question is no longer, does this person look healthy? It becomes, how is their metabolism actually functioning? And that leads us to the next mystery. If insulin resistance can remain hidden for years, what exactly is happening inside the body during that hidden period? What happens when the pancreas keeps producing more insulin? What role do sleep and stress play? Why does visceral fat appear to behave differently from fat stored under the skin? And can two people with the same BMI have dramatically different metabolic futures? To answer those questions, we have to follow the insulin signal deeper, from the bloodstream into the liver, muscles, and fat tissue, because that is where the quiet battle is taking place. And once we see what those tissues are doing, the idea of a person who looks healthy starts to look very different. The first chapter left us with a strange contradiction. A person can look healthy. Their weight can fall within a normal range. Their blood sugar can appear reassuring. And yet, their metabolism may already be under pressure. To understand why, we need to look beyond the mirror and beyond a single blood test. Inside the body, insulin resistance is not one event. It is a gradual change in how several tissues respond to the same hormonal signal: the liver, the muscles, the fat tissue, and eventually, the pancreas itself. Each plays a different role, and together they can determine whether the body maintains metabolic balance or slowly loses it. Start with the muscles. After a meal, glucose enters the bloodstream. Insulin rises, and skeletal muscle normally takes up a large share of that glucose. But when muscle becomes less responsive to insulin, the signal does not work as efficiently. The body can compensate for a while. The pancreas releases more insulin. Blood glucose may remain within a relatively normal range. From the outside, nothing dramatic has happened. But internally, the system is working harder. Now move to the liver. The liver is supposed to respond to insulin by reducing the amount of glucose it releases into the bloodstream. When the liver becomes insulin resistant, that control can weaken. The liver may continue releasing glucose when the body does not need as much. That creates another burden. The pancreas has to work harder again, and then there is fat tissue. This is where the story becomes especially interesting. Not all body fat behaves in exactly the same way. Fat stored beneath the skin is not biologically identical to fat accumulated around internal organs. Visceral fat, the fat surrounding organs inside the abdomen, has been associated with insulin resistance and cardiometabolic risk. Researchers have spent years trying to understand why. One explanation involves the way excess energy is stored. When the body's normal storage capacity is exceeded, fat can accumulate in places where it may interfere with normal metabolic function. The liver and muscle, for example, can accumulate fat. Scientists have studied this phenomenon extensively because excess fat in these organs is associated with insulin resistance. But again, there is an important distinction. Association does not automatically prove that one single type of fat causes every case of insulin resistance. Human metabolism is more complicated than that. Genetics matters, age matters, physical activity matters, dietary patterns matter, sleep matters, hormones matter, and the interactions between these factors may matter even more. That is why two people with similar body weight can have very different metabolic profiles. Researchers sometimes describe this as a difference in metabolic health rather than simply body size. And this is one reason the phrase healthy weight can be misleading when it is treated as a complete description of someone's health. A normal BMI can be useful, but BMI is a population-level measure. It cannot directly tell us how much visceral fat a person has, how sensitive their muscles are to insulin, or how much fat is stored in the liver. It cannot reveal someone's genetic susceptibility, and it cannot tell us how their metabolism will behave 10 years from now. This is where the story becomes personal. Imagine two people. They are the same age. They have almost identical height and weight. Their BMI is similar. Neither looks obviously unhealthy, but one has better insulin sensitivity, healthier blood lipid levels, and less visceral fat. The other has more visceral fat, a less favorable metabolic profile, and early signs of impaired glucose regulation. If you judged only by appearance, you might assume they were equally healthy. Biologically, they may not be. This does not mean every person with normal weight should assume they have insulin resistance. That would simply replace one oversimplification with another. The point is that appearance alone cannot settle the question, and this is where sleep enters the investigation. Sleep may seem far removed from insulin. It is not. Research has linked short or disrupted sleep with changes in glucose metabolism and insulin sensitivity. Experimental studies have found that sleep restriction can impair insulin sensitivity, while observational research has repeatedly associated poor sleep with metabolic risk. But scientists still debate exactly how much of the association is directly caused by sleep itself and how much reflects other factors. People who sleep poorly may also experience stress, changes in activity, altered eating patterns, or other health problems. So the evidence does not justify a simple claim that one bad night causes insulin resistance. The more interesting question is what happens when poor sleep becomes a long-term pattern. And that leads to another hidden connection: stress. The body has powerful hormonal systems designed to respond to danger. Hormones such as cortisol help mobilize energy when the body believes it needs to respond quickly. That is useful in short bursts, but chronic stress is different. Long-term stress can affect sleep, appetite, physical activity, and metabolic regulation. Researchers have investigated links between chronic stress, cortisol, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes risk. Yet once again, this is not a simple cause and effect story. Stress is difficult to measure. Human lives are complicated, and metabolic disease rarely has one explanation. That uncertainty is important. A documentary about insulin resistance should not turn every modern problem into a hidden disease. It should do something more difficult. It should separate what we know from what we suspect. We know that insulin resistance is closely connected to type 2 diabetes. We know that excess body fat, especially certain patterns of fat distribution, can increase metabolic risk. We know that physical inactivity is associated with higher risk. We know that family history and genetics can influence susceptibility. We know that prediabetes can remain silent for years. But we do not have a perfect explanation for why every individual develops insulin resistance, and there is no single test that can capture the entire story in every person. Researchers can measure insulin sensitivity using sophisticated methods. One of the most precise research techniques is called the hyperinsulinemic euglycemic clamp. It can provide a detailed assessment of how the body responds to insulin, but it is complex, expensive, and mainly used in research settings. Clinical medicine usually relies on more practical measurements, such as blood glucose and A1C, alongside a person's medical history and risk factors. This creates another fascinating gap. The condition we are trying to understand can begin before the condition we routinely diagnose. Insulin resistance can precede prediabetes. Prediabetes can precede type 2 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes itself may develop gradually. That does not mean progression is inevitable. It means the timeline can be much longer than people realize, and this is where there is reason for hope. Metabolic health is not completely fixed. Research has shown that changes in physical activity, body composition, and other modifiable factors can improve insulin sensitivity and reduce the risk of progressing to type 2 diabetes in people at high risk. The landmark Diabetes Prevention Program, for example, found that an intensive lifestyle intervention reduced the development of type 2 diabetes among participants with elevated risk. Importantly, this does not mean there is one universal lifestyle prescription for everyone, nor does it mean medication is inherently bad or unnecessary. In some people, medications are an important part of diabetes prevention or treatment. The correct approach depends on the individual, their risk, their health history, and guidance from qualified clinicians. That distinction matters because insulin resistance is often discussed online as if it were a personal battle between natural health and medicine. Real medicine is more complicated. There are people who benefit from lifestyle changes. There are people who need medication. There are people who need both. And there are people whose metabolic risk is shaped by factors they cannot simply change through willpower. The science does not support blaming patients. It supports understanding risk. And perhaps the most encouraging discovery is that metabolic disease does not always follow a straight line. A person can move toward greater risk, but risk can also change. That means catching metabolic problems earlier can matter. Not because everyone needs to become obsessed with blood sugar, but because silent disease is easier to ignore when there are no symptoms. And this brings us back to the original mystery. Why can someone who looks healthy develop insulin resistance? The answer is not one hidden ingredient. It is an interaction between biology and environment. Genetic susceptibility can influence how the body stores fat. Fat distribution can influence metabolic function. The liver and muscles can become less responsive to insulin. Physical inactivity can increase risk. Poor sleep and other factors may contribute. Age and family history can shift the odds. And the pancreas can compensate for a surprisingly long time before glucose levels rise enough to trigger concern. Eventually, in some people, compensation is no longer enough. Blood glucose rises, prediabetes can appear, and for some, type 2 diabetes follows. But the final lesson is not that a normal-looking person is secretly sick. That would be another misleading conclusion. The lesson is much simpler. Health is more complicated than appearance. A person can look healthy and still have risk factors that deserve attention. And a person can have risk factors without being destined to develop diabetes. That distinction between risk and destiny is one of the most important things to understand. Insulin resistance is not a verdict. It is a biological process, and biological processes can change. The real challenge is recognizing that the body often whispers before it shouts. There may be years between the beginning of metabolic dysfunction and the moment diabetes is diagnosed. That is why researchers continue to study the earliest stages, trying to identify who is most vulnerable, which changes happen first, and whether intervention can alter the trajectory before permanent damage occurs. We still do not have every answer, but we know enough to reject one dangerous assumption, that looking healthy means being metabolically healthy. Sometimes the most important changes happening inside the body are the ones nobody can see. And if there is one question worth carrying forward, it is not, do I look healthy? It is, how healthy is my metabolism, and how would I actually know? For anyone concerned about their own risk, the answer should come from appropriate medical evaluation, not self-diagnosis or internet tests. A qualified healthcare professional can interpret glucose measurements, A1C, family history, body composition, symptoms, and other risk factors in context. The mystery is not completely solved, but the picture is becoming clearer. Insulin resistance is not a single disease that suddenly appears. It is often a gradual shift, one that can remain hidden behind a normal face, a normal routine, and sometimes even a normal-looking number on the scale. And that may be the most important discovery of all.